Imagine uncovering a horrifying family secret, one so devastating that it drives a man to the edge of sanity. A secret that, in a fit of blind rage, pushes a preacher to sever his father's manhood, violently avenging the greatest betrayal he could ever imagine. A life, a family, built on unwavering faith and trust, is shattered in an instant. This is not just a tragedy. It is a tale of torment, revenge, and destruction. It is the story of a man whose belief in God, family, and the very principles that once defined him were all crushed under the weight of an unbearable truth. Pastor David Thomas, 42, had always been the embodiment of devotion in his small town in Alabama. To his community, he was a symbol of moral uprightness, an unshakable pillar in a world that often seemed to bend under the pressures of doubt and corruption. David was the pastor of the local Baptist church, and his words carried weight, his sermons echoing through the pews like a clarion call to all who listened. He preached about faith, about family, and about living a life of righteousness. He led a life that many admired, for he was the personification of everything his church stood for. His life was his ministry, and his ministry was his life. David's congregation was large, drawn by his passionate speeches, his ability to connect with people on a personal level. He had cultivated a loyal following, a group of people who believed in his every word, who hung on his every sermon, and who turned to him for guidance in times of trouble. His words, filled with conviction, touched the hearts of the masses. But David wasn't just a preacher. He was a father, a husband, and a man of unyielding faith. His family, the foundation of his existence, was a picture of harmony and virtue. His wife, Sarah Thomas, 38, was everything one could ask for in a pastor's wife. Graceful and composed, she balanced the duties of being a preacher's wife with those of a devoted mother. Together, they had 5 children: Emily, Lucas, Noah, Sophia, and Liam. The Thomas family was a staple in the community, their presence often marked by Sarah's constant engagement in church activities, from organizing charity events to teaching Sunday school. At the heart of their family's spiritual foundation was Deacon James Thomas, David's 65-year-old father. James was a respected elder in the church, a man who had dedicated his life to service and to guiding others in their faith. James had a profound influence on David's upbringing. From an early age, he instilled in David a deep respect for the Word of God and a commitment to living by Scripture. James was the embodiment of moral integrity in David's eyes. Every Sunday, David would stand at the pulpit and extol his father's virtues, referring to him as the rock upon which their family was built. James was the man who had shaped David's character, who had taught him the importance of family, loyalty, and faithfulness. But life, as it often does, can change in an instant. One evening, as the family sat together around their oak dining table, something happened that would alter the course of their lives forever. It began innocently enough. Emily, at 16, had been given an assignment at school to trace the family's genealogy for a project. Excited, she suggested to the family that they all take DNA tests to learn about their ancestry. The idea was met with enthusiasm from her youngest siblings, who eagerly chimed in with playful guesses about their heritage. David, always supportive of his children's educational pursuits, smiled and agreed, assuring Emily that it would be a fun family activity. "That sounds like a great idea," he said warmly. "It'll be something we can all do together." His children were excited, each of them imagining themselves related to royalty or perhaps discovering distant, long-lost ancestors who had played pivotal roles in history. Sarah, however, seemed hesitant. Her smile faltered as she reached for her glass of water, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know, Emily," Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "These tests aren't always accurate. They can be invasive." Her words hung in the air, the unease in her voice not lost on anyone. David, ever the optimist, dismissed her concerns. "Come on, Sarah, it's just a fun family activity, and it'll be good for Emily's project. We've got nothing to hide." He placed his hand over hers, offering her a reassuring smile. Sarah hesitated, glancing briefly at James, who sat at the head of the table, his usual stern expression unchanged. She sighed and nodded slowly. "All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure about this." With that, David ordered the DNA kits, and the family continued with their meal, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. James, though silent, gave a tight smile, his thoughts unreadable. The kits arrived a few weeks later, and Emily, eager to see the results, gathered the family together around the computer. The air was thick with anticipation as David logged into the website to view the results. They were met with a wealth of information about their ancestry, ancestral origins, and historical connections. But as David scrolled through the results, his brow furrowed. Something didn't add up. "Wait a minute," David muttered, leaning in closer to the screen. "It says I'm not a match to any of the kids as their biological father." He laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "That's obviously a mistake. Probably just some kind of database error." Sarah froze. Her hand tightened around the armrest of her chair, and her eyes darted to David. James, who had been silent, now turned his gaze toward his son, his face impassive, but his jaw visibly clenched. David, feeling the tension rising, quickly assured Sarah. "I'll reach out to the company," he said. "There's no reason to panic. They probably just mixed up the data. I'll get it sorted out." He stood and kissed Sarah on the top of her head, trying to calm her. "Don't worry." But Sarah's unease only grew as the days passed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Weeks passed in a blur of mounting tension. David's efforts to contact the genealogy company had been fruitless. The days turned into an agonizing stretch of silence, the uncertainty eating away at him from the inside. His thoughts began to spiral. What if the results were correct? What if Sarah had lied? What if the man who had been his role model for all his life, the man he had trusted implicitly, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way? David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, images of his family, the family he thought he knew, flashed before him. His children, his pride and joy, none of them were truly his. The thought was unbearable, each second stretching into an eternity. His mind raced, and in the quiet of the night, the truth began to take shape in the darkest corners of his mind. He remembered everything. How James had always been a little too friendly with Sarah. How his father's visits had grown more frequent in the years following his marriage. He thought back to the subtle glances between Sarah and James, the uneasy silences during family meals, the way Sarah had once looked at him with that distant, unreadable expression when he spoke of his father's influence. And now, the DNA test results had confirmed the most horrifying possibility of all. The next morning, as he sat at the breakfast table with his family, David was distant, barely registering the casual chatter of his children as they prepared for their day. He had tried to bury his suspicions, to brush them aside as nothing more than paranoid delusions. But now, he could no longer ignore them. His mind was consumed by the truth that was too monstrous to face, but which he could no longer deny. It was at that very moment that the phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar, but David hardly heard the words. All he could focus on was the finality of the situation, the dreadful realization that his worst fears had come true. The results from the genealogy company had arrived. Finally, David's heart hammered in his chest as he walked slowly into the study to read the response, his fingers trembling with each word he read. "We have thoroughly reviewed the data," the letter began. "The children's biological father is not you, Pastor David Thomas. We have verified the results several times, and the genetic markers match another individual, a close relative." The confirmation sent a shockwave through him. His father, James. It was all he could think about. The revelation struck like a bolt of lightning. His mind reeled as the pieces of his life shattered into jagged fragments. The church, his ministry, his children, none of it was real. The life he had built, the family he had trusted, was all based on a lie. He staggered back from the letter, the room spinning around him. He could no longer look at his children the same way. They were his, in his heart, but genetically they were not. Sarah, his beloved wife, the woman who had stood beside him through every trial, had been unfaithful to him in the worst way possible. But it wasn't just betrayal. It was abuse, coercion, and a grotesque manipulation of trust. His father, the man who had raised him, had taken what was his in the most unforgivable way. David's hands clenched into fists, the anger and betrayal rising like a wave that threatened to drown him. His father, he had always looked up to him, had always admired him. But now, that admiration had turned to disgust. His father was a monster, a man who had stolen from him in the most visceral way possible. Later that evening, David returned home, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Sarah was in the living room, folding laundry, her movements slow and mechanical, as though she could sense the storm brewing. When she saw David walk in, holding the printed DNA results in his hand, her face paled. "David, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice shaky, already sensing that something was terribly amiss. David threw the papers onto the table with a force that made them flutter, his eyes burning with an intensity that terrified her. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice sharp and cold, like a blade ready to strike. Sarah's eyes darted from the papers to his face, her confusion mounting. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. She could barely bring herself to look at the results, as though the truth might jump off the page and strike her down. David leaned in closer, his breath ragged. "The DNA results, Sarah. They say I'm not the father of our children. But there's another match, a close relative. Care to explain that?" Sarah froze, her face draining of color. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her body went rigid. She couldn't speak. The words, the truth, were too much to process. Her world was crashing down around her. David's voice rose, cutting through the air with a searing intensity. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I went back to the company. They verified it. There's no mistake. So I'm asking you again, explain this." Sarah's world came crashing down. She felt the room close in on her, suffocating her. She had no escape from the reality of what David had just discovered. Her hands began to tremble, and she sank into the chair behind her. Tears welled in her eyes as she broke down, her sobs echoing in the silence of the room. "I couldn't stop it, David," she whispered, her voice breaking with every word. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to destroy you. I didn't want to destroy our family." David's heart pounded in his chest, and he staggered backward, his mind spinning. "What are you talking about?" he gasped. His voice was barely a whisper now, as though he couldn't process what he was hearing. "I was trapped," Sarah sobbed. "Your father, James, he coerced me. He made me do things. For years, I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to hurt you. All 5 of them, they're his." The world seemed to stop around him. The words, the meaning, the betrayal, they hit David like a freight train. His father, the man he had revered, the man he had thought was the epitome of morality, had violated his wife, had fathered his children. The life he had built was nothing more than a facade. His father had taken from him, and his wife had been complicit in the horror. David's head spun. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing down, suffocating him with the enormity of the revelation. The woman he loved, the father he admired, both had betrayed him in the most brutal, most intimate way possible. His world had come undone, piece by piece, and there was no putting it back together. He staggered out of the house, his mind a whirlwind of rage, disbelief, and pain. The emotions crashed over him in waves, each one more violent than the last. His heart, once full of love and compassion, now burned with the fire of betrayal. How could they do this to him? How could they destroy everything he had built? David drove aimlessly for hours, the quiet streets of his town passing by in a blur. The empty roads reflected the emptiness inside him, the realization that his life had been a lie, that his family had been nothing more than a cruel deception, was more than he could bear. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, screaming into the night. His anger was consuming him, twisting and turning, until there was nothing left but vengeance. He knew what he had to do. When David returned home, he was eerily calm. Sarah had spent the night in their bedroom, crying uncontrollably. She was on edge, dreading the confrontation that was coming. She knew what she had done, and now there was no escaping the consequences. David walked into the living room, his eyes dark and emotionless. Sarah looked up at him, her face twisted with fear, her body trembling with a mixture of guilt and hope. "David," she whispered, her voice broken. "I know you're hurt, but we can fix this. We can talk about this." David didn't speak. He merely reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a kitchen knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. The cold steel reflected his shattered soul as he stepped closer to Sarah. "You destroyed everything." David's voice was a low growl, his words full of contempt. "You lied to me every single day, Sarah. You let him violate our marriage, father my children, and sit at our table as if nothing was wrong." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she fell to her knees. "Please, David," she sobbed. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop it. Please, I love you. We can fix this." But David's rage was unstoppable. With a swift and brutal movement, he plunged the knife into her chest. Sarah gasped in shock, her wide eyes locking onto his as the blade tore through her body. The room was filled with a sickening sound of flesh tearing. David's expression was cold, void of mercy as he pulled the knife out and struck again. This time, he drove the blade deep into her abdomen. Sarah screamed, her body trembling as she tried to crawl away. But David was relentless, the knife in his hands a tool of retribution. "You should have told me the truth." David spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You should have stopped him." David's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stood over Sarah's lifeless body. His hands shook violently, stained with her blood, but there was no sense of relief, no sense of justice. The anger that had fueled his actions moments ago was now a cold emptiness. The room, once filled with life and laughter, was now a silent witness to brutality. The walls, the furniture, even the air felt tainted by the horror that had just unfolded. David took a step back, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of his rage. The knife, now slick with blood, seemed almost foreign in his hand. He dropped it to the floor with a clatter, his mind racing. The woman he had loved, the mother of his children, was gone. He had taken her life, believing it was the only way to right the wrong she had inflicted on him. But as he looked at her body, his anger began to dissipate, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of loss. There was nothing left for him now. For a long moment, he stood there, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. His heart, once full of love and devotion to his family, now lay in ruins. His children, the very ones he had fought to protect and raise with the utmost care, were not his. The man who had raised him, the man he had trusted more than anyone in the world, had violated his wife. David's life had been a lie, and now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. He left the room quietly, as though the house itself would crumble beneath the weight of his grief and anger. The streets outside were quiet, the moon casting an eerie glow over the town. But inside David, there was a storm. His thoughts, once consumed by righteous anger, now wrestled with guilt, regret, and a sense of finality that he could not escape. But there was one more thing to be done. One more person who needed to face justice. David knew what he had to do. His father, James, the man who had been a father figure to him, the man who had taught him everything he knew about life and faith, needed to answer for his betrayal. His father's actions had not just destroyed his marriage, they had torn apart everything David had ever known. The weight of his anger, combined with the overwhelming sense of betrayal, was too much to bear. David drove through the night, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts consumed by the need for vengeance. He had no destination in mind, only the unshakable certainty that James needed to pay for what he had done. David had preached for years about forgiveness, about the healing power of faith. But now, forgiveness was a distant thought, a hollow concept that had no place in his heart. The need for retribution burned too fiercely within him. The headlights of his car illuminated the road ahead, but it did little to lighten the darkness that had taken root within him. His thoughts were a tangled mess of rage and sorrow. What had James done to him? What kind of monster was he to destroy a family like this? To take something so precious and corrupt it beyond recognition? As David neared James's house, his mind became clearer. The house, sitting quietly in the stillness of the night, seemed almost surreal to him. This was a place where he had grown up, where he had been taught the values he held so dearly. And now, it was the place where everything would end. David parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a long while, staring at the darkness around him. His father, who had always been the foundation of his life, the person he had trusted above all others, was a mere shadow now, a reflection of a man who no longer existed in his mind. David's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he realized the truth. The father he had known was gone, replaced by a vile stranger who had destroyed everything he held dear. He stepped out of the car, walking slowly toward the door. His steps were deliberate, measured, as though he were walking to meet his destiny. His pulse raced, but there was no turning back now. The door creaked as David pushed it open, the sound sharp in the quiet house. James was sitting at the dining table, a cup of tea in front of him, the Bible open in his hands, as though nothing had changed. The man who had once been the moral compass of David's life was sitting there, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon him. "David." James looked up, his voice laced with confusion and a hint of fear. "What are you doing here?" David didn't answer. Instead, he threw the crumpled DNA results onto the table, his eyes locked onto his father's face. "Explain this," David demanded, his voice low but seething with a quiet, lethal anger. James's eyes flicked to the papers and then back to David. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice faltering as he tried to maintain control. "David, please, just don't lie to me," David interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "You've been violating Sarah for years. You fathered my children. Don't you dare try to deny it. You destroyed my family." James stood up slowly, his hands raised in a defensive posture, as if he could somehow calm his son. "David, listen to me. It's not what you think. David's rage erupted in an instant. Without another word, he lunged at his father, driving the knife into his side with brutal force. James cried out, stumbling backward as blood began to seep through his shirt. The once strong, unwavering figure David had admired now seemed so fragile, so weak in the face of his son's fury. "You ruined my life," David screamed, his voice a guttural, desperate cry of anguish. "You betrayed me. You took everything from me." With savage precision, David drove the knife in again and again, each strike fueled by years of repressed rage and bitterness. James crumpled to the floor, gasping for air as blood pooled around him. His strength was failing, his cries weakening with each passing moment. David stood over him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His father, the man who had taught him everything, was now nothing more than a broken, bleeding husk, lying in the ruins of the life they had both built. There was no forgiveness left in David's heart, no room for redemption. All that remained was this grotesque act of retribution. "This is for Sarah," David muttered, his voice cold and distant. "This is for the years of lies." James tried to crawl away, but his body was too weak. His breaths were shallow, desperate. David knelt beside him, his face expressionless, as he began the gruesome act of cutting off his father's manhood. James's screams filled the room, but David's focus remained unshaken. The pain in his heart, the betrayal that had driven him to this point, demanded that James face this ultimate punishment. The screams weakened, and within moments, James lay still, his body trembling violently before finally going limp. The silence that followed was suffocating. David stood up slowly, staring at the lifeless body of the man he had once called his father. There was no satisfaction in his actions, no sense of justice, only a hollow emptiness. David dropped the knife to the floor, its cold steel clattering on the hardwood. His chest heaved as he stepped back, his body covered in the blood of his father and his wife. He was a man undone, his soul as broken as the family he had once cherished. The reality of what he had just done began to settle in, and with it came a crushing wave of regret. But there was no turning back. David walked out of the house and sat on the front porch, his hands shaking as he looked down at the blood-stained Bible in his lap. The quiet town seemed to mock him, its peacefulness in stark contrast to the horrors that had just unfolded. When the police arrived, responding to the frantic calls from neighbors who had heard screams and crashing noises, they found David sitting on the porch, drenched in blood, the Bible resting in his lap. His demeanor was calm, almost eerie. His expression was unreadable, but there was no hint of remorse in his eyes. One of the officers approached him cautiously. "David Thomas," the officer said, his voice unsure. "What happened here?" David looked up at him, his voice calm and almost detached. "It's done," he said simply. "God's justice has been served." As the officers moved past him, one of them ventured inside the house. What they found was beyond comprehension. 2 bodies, mutilated and destroyed by violence. The scene was a grotesque reflection of the anger, betrayal, and pain that had fueled David's actions. Back at the station, David confessed to the murders, his voice eerily calm. "They destroyed our family," he said. "I just finished what they started." The scene at the police station was one of surreal calmness, in stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. David sat in the interrogation room, the cold metal chair beneath him feeling more like a cage than a seat. His hands, still trembling from the adrenaline rush, rested on the table, the bloodstains from his father's house faintly visible on his palms. His demeanor, though, was strangely composed, almost as if he had stepped outside of himself and was watching the horrors unfold from a distant vantage point. One of the officers, clearly unsettled by the brutality they had witnessed, leaned in across the table. "David," he began cautiously, "do you realize what you've done? You've killed your father and your wife, a man of your standing, a preacher, a pillar of the community. How could this happen?" David's gaze was fixed straight ahead, his eyes distant as if he was staring through the officer. His voice was steady, void of any of the remorse or regret one might expect from a man who had just committed such heinous acts. "They destroyed everything I believed in," David replied flatly. "My wife, my father, my children, all of it was built on lies. Everything I had known, everything I had trusted, was a fabrication. They took everything from me, and now I've taken it back." The officer, visibly shaken, leaned back in his chair. He had no answer to David's cold, matter-of-fact tone. What could one say in the face of such brutality? The evidence, the confession, it all pointed to the same chilling conclusion. David Thomas, once a beacon of faith, had descended into the darkest corner of humanity, driven by betrayal and revenge. As the night dragged on, David's confession became more detailed. He spoke of his relationship with Sarah, the life they had built together, and the children he had raised as his own. Each word was like a hammer to the heart, stripping away any illusion that this man had once been the embodiment of righteousness. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of someone who had lived a lifetime of grief hidden beneath the surface until it all came crashing down in one explosive, devastating moment. "The love I had for her," David continued, "was real. It wasn't just for show, like everything else in our lives. But what she did, what my father did, it's something I couldn't undo. They took my life and twisted it, so I had to take it back." News of the murders quickly spread throughout the small town, and soon it was impossible to avoid. David Thomas, the beloved pastor, the man whose voice had once filled the church with inspiring sermons about faith and hope, had become a murderer. The community, who had once looked to him for guidance, was left in shock and disbelief. How could this happen? How could someone so devout, so admired, be capable of such violence? The church, once a place of peace and refuge, became a place of grief and confusion. Members of the congregation gathered in hushed groups, whispering about the preacher who had fallen from grace. They struggled to reconcile the man they had once revered with the man who had just committed unimaginable atrocities. His sermons, once full of hope and salvation, now felt like lies, a mask that had been worn too long. Pastor David Thomas, once the heart of the community, was now a figure of terror, a symbol of the devastating power of secrets and betrayal. The church's foundation, built on trust and faith, crumbled under the weight of the truth that had been exposed. Those who had once seen David as a moral compass now questioned everything they had ever believed. The case quickly gained national attention. What had been a small-town tragedy became a media spectacle, with news outlets clamoring for every shred of information they could find. The story of Pastor David Thomas, the man who had preached about forgiveness, who had built his life on faith and family, and who had brutally killed both his wife and his father, captivated the public. The question on everyone's mind was simple: how could such a thing happen? The press descended upon the small town like a swarm, reporters from all over the country rushing to cover the story. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in the faces of anyone who had known David or Sarah, and the community was thrust into the spotlight. Some mourned the loss of a man they had once respected, while others couldn't contain their outrage. When the time came for David's trial, it wasn't just a trial about the brutal murders of Sarah and James Thomas. It was a trial about faith, family, and betrayal. The prosecution argued that David had premeditated the murders, pointing to the brutality of his actions, particularly the gruesome mutilation of his father. They painted him as a man consumed by rage, whose need for retribution had led him to commit unforgivable acts. The defense, however, portrayed David as a man pushed beyond his limits, a man whose entire world had been shattered in an instant. They argued that David had been driven to madness by the revelation that his wife had been abused by his father and that his children were not his own. They called in psychologists to testify that David's actions were the result of years of emotional trauma, an unbearable betrayal that no one could have predicted. David sat quietly during the trial, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't try to defend his actions. In his mind, the truth had already been revealed, and there was nothing more to be said. His world had ended the moment he discovered the truth about his father and wife. The rest, he believed, was just the inevitable consequence of that knowledge. After several weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging the complexity of the case, sentenced David to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no redemption for him, no second chance. The man who had once been a beacon of faith was now a prisoner of his own actions. The Thomas family was no longer the picture of faith and unity that it had once been. David's descent from a revered preacher to a figure of horror left a deep scar on the community. The children, now separated and placed in foster care, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The world they had known, filled with love, faith, and stability, had crumbled, leaving them to navigate a world full of uncertainty and grief. David's legacy, once defined by his sermons and the example he had set for his congregation, was now one of terror and betrayal. His life, his family, his ministry, everything he had worked for, had been consumed by a single, horrifying truth. David's story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how deeply secrets could poison the soul and how betrayal, even when buried for years, could destroy everything in its wake. His fall from grace was a testament to the destructive power of hidden truths, a lesson that the community would carry with them for years to come. As the years passed, the town slowly began to rebuild itself, the echoes of David's actions fading into the background. But the question remained: was David's violence the inevitable result of betrayal, or did he cross a line that no amount of pain could justify? Was there ever a justification for such brutality, no matter how deep the wound? And in the end, did David find the peace he so desperately sought, or was he left to live with the hollow emptiness of his choices, forever haunted by the ghosts of those he had once loved? This story, dark and painful, is a stark reminder that even the most devout can be broken, that no one is immune to the corrosive effects of secrets and betrayal. And as we reflect on David Thomas's tragic fall, we are left to wonder, what would you have done had you been in his shoes?